You're about to hear something that shouldn't exist at the same time: a ceasefire and a blockade. One promises silence, the other enforces control. And yet, both are happening right now. But that's not even the strangest part. Because somewhere in one of the most dangerous waterways on Earth, ships are still moving, slowly, cautiously, like they're being watched. And maybe they are. The question is, who decides what happens to them next? A conversation begins. Calm voices. Legal language. But underneath it, tension. A specialist in international law starts explaining something that sounds simple: blockades are allowed during war. That's the rule. That's the system. But rules don't always mean what you think they mean. Because here's the first twist: blockades aren't just about stopping ships. They're about control, economic pressure, invisible force. You don't fire a missile, you choke the system instead. But here's the strange part: not every ship is supposed to be stopped. Some are allowed through. Neutral trade. Innocent cargo. At least in theory. So now the question changes. How do you decide what's neutral and what isn't? And that's when things start to get complicated. Because if even one ship slips through, does that mean the blockade is weak? Or is that part of the design? And if the blockade is working, then something else must also be true. Something far more dangerous. The rule sounds clear at first. If a blockade exists, it must be effective. Not symbolic. Not partial. Real. Enforced. But effectiveness isn't just about stopping ships. It's about proving control over an entire space. And this is where it gets weird. Because so far, only one vessel has reportedly made it through. Just one. Which raises a strange possibility. Is that failure or proof that the system is working exactly as intended? Now think about this. If most ships are stopped, redirected, or inspected, the message spreads fast. You don't need to block everything. You just need everyone to believe you can. But here's the deeper layer. There's another rule. One that changes everything. A blockade cannot starve civilians. It cannot cut off food, medicine, survival itself. And suddenly, this isn't just strategy anymore. It's a moral boundary. So now the question shifts again. Where is the line between pressure and punishment? Because history has seen this before. Blockades that claimed legality, but caused suffering. And critics are already watching closely, asking whether this one will cross that invisible line. But here's the twist. So far, it appears to be by the book. Controlled, calculated, careful. And that should make things safer, right? But that's not even the craziest part. Because something happened that changes the entire meaning of what we're seeing. A ceasefire came first. A ceasefire. A pause. A moment where weapons are supposed to fall silent. That's the expectation. That's the illusion of stability. But then a blockade is imposed. And everything breaks. Because here's the contradiction. Can you really have peace while enforcing control like this? And this is where it gets uncomfortable. There's no strict law that defines a ceasefire. It's just an agreement. A temporary understanding. Fragile. Flexible. Easy to break without officially saying so. But a blockade? That's different. Declaring a blockade is not neutral. It's not passive. It's a signal. A message that says, this is still a conflict. And suddenly, the illusion disappears. Because if you enforce a blockade, you are acknowledging war. Not maybe. Not potentially. Directly. And that leads to a disturbing realization. The ceasefire might not actually exist anymore. Not in any meaningful way. But here's the strange part. No one has clearly said it's over. So now we're in a space between definitions. Not peace. Not full war. Something in between. And that's where things become unpredictable. Because in this gray zone, decisions aren't always clear. And when decisions aren't clear, mistakes happen. And when mistakes happen, what happens next changes everything. Imagine you're on a ship. Neutral. No weapons. Just cargo. You're moving through a tense, silent stretch of water. Then suddenly a signal. You've been flagged. Now comes the question, do you stop? Legally, it's not completely clear. There's no simple yes or no. No universal rule forcing you to submit. But here's the twist. If you don't stop, you might become a target. Let that sink in. Not because you attacked. Not because you threatened. But because you refused to be searched. And that changes everything. Because now compliance isn't just about law. It's about survival. So most ships will stop. Not because they have to, but because the risk is too high. And this creates a strange kind of control, one built on pressure rather than force. But here's where it gets even more intense. All of this is happening in one of the narrowest and most sensitive waterways in the world. Ships, military vessels, different nations, all moving close enough to see each other. And that raises a terrifying question. How close is too close? Because it doesn't take much. A misunderstanding, a wrong move, a delayed response, and suddenly, a controlled situation becomes something else entirely. Something explosive. But here's the strange part. It might not even happen where you expect. Because the real strategy isn't in the narrowest point at all. You'd think the most dangerous place would be the narrowest stretch, where ships are packed tightly together, where tension is highest, where one mistake could trigger everything. But that's not where this is likely to unfold. And this is where it gets unexpected. The enforcement line isn't at the tightest point. It's further out, in wider waters, where there's space, distance, time to react. It sounds safer, more controlled. But here's the twist. That distance also creates uncertainty, because now ships are being stopped before they even reach their destination. Questions are asked earlier, decisions are made faster, and assumptions become dangerous. So now the system relies on information. Where are you going? What are you carrying? Who do you belong to? And if the answers don't align, everything changes. Because in this kind of conflict, perception becomes reality. And that leads to the final, unsettling thought. What if a single wrong assumption triggers something irreversible? Because all it takes is one ship, one decision, one moment of hesitation. And suddenly, the balance collapses. So here's the question that remains. If a ceasefire can exist alongside a blockade, if ships must choose between compliance and risk, if war can be declared without being named, then what are we really looking at? Peace? Or just a quieter form of conflict, waiting for the moment